Good afternoon. Welcome to the next unit in our series, Leading with Personality. I'm Alan, if you've not joined before, and we are on LinkedIn Live, Facebook Live, YouTube Live, and Instagram Live right now. So I'll stall for about 60 seconds to a minute while our audience builds. The chat is live, the chat is open. So if you want to join us on the chat, you can always ask questions, raise concerns. Um, but yeah, because I'm learning as we go, just like hopefully you're learning some things as well. Real quick background while I'm sort of stalling for the audience to build is that this is built largely around the Myers-Briggs. And I have a slide that I'll get to, but I'll go ahead and tell you that, there are a few flaws with the Myers-Briggs, one of which is that apparently I learned a few years ago that Isabella Briggs Myers, who's the creator of that tool, wrote a fiction book with harmful racial stereotypes, right? So as we engage in this, we need to kind of bring our anti-racist lens. We need to sort of work towards decolonizing our thinking about this. Can it be done? I hope so. I hope so, because I think the tool has some powerful uses if we can be aware. The other thing is, if there are any academics joining me, right? And I've spent 20 years working at colleges and universities, but I'm not an academic deep down in my bones, but I'm well versed in sort of the epistemological conversations, methodological conversations about what makes good research good research. And I know that Carl Jung, who came up with the theory on which the Myers-Briggs is based, came up with a theory using what a lot of researchers might call backyard research, right? Which is he had a client base and he used that client base as participants to build this framework, right? Was his client base representative of all people? No, most certainly not. Could he have done built in other protocols, double blind studies, things, randomized participant selection? Could he have done other methodological things to make this stronger? Oh, most certainly, right? In his era, given what he had, I think he was operating reasonably well. But we know a lot more about how to build research that's generalizable, right? And so as I, thread the needle between generalizing and not generalizing as we talk about this, I just want us to be aware of that as well, that the methodological frameworks and even the epistemological frameworks, if you want to dig even deeper, um, are ones that invite more questions. And so we can have those questions. And I think we can still use this framework as a conversation piece, as a launching pad, as a way to talk about difference and preference in our workplaces. And that's what we're here to do. So let's do it. Management doesn't care enough, right? So I work with a lot of HR teams, and with HR teams, they're very well versed in exit interview data. And the exit interview data, you hear from people who are leaving organizations different complaints. And it occurs to me many of these complaints are grounded in personality differences, a la things that we could discuss using the Myers-Briggs as a framework, right? So if you were with us for the last several sessions, our last two sessions leading up to this were about the second letter of the Myers-Briggs. The second letter is how one absorbs the world, either through sensing or intuition. This is how Jung conceives of it and frames it. And in my work, I've come to find that that's a very valuable way to frame this discussion, and it can help us bridge gaps in understanding and work better together. So the second letter of the Myers-Briggs, and we'll kind of skip ahead here. Today, I also want to be honest and transparent. I'm a little under the weather, so today's session might be a little shorter than most because I need to do some self-care as well. This is me, and this is some of what I've studied and some of what I do. This is sort of the real story, which is you could look at this slide here easily and think, oh, this guy clearly has his act together and is a fully formed, competent adult. And I think I am, but I wasn't always. And those numbers at the top tell that story, that I, as an undergraduate student, took 7 years to finish, and my GPA was an abysmal 2.16. And so even when I got into graduate school the first time I applied, I got rejected. And so then there was a story of sort of how I was able to get in and take some classes and then prove myself, right? That's all to say, though, that I once thought that people with more degrees necessarily were well put together, and I guess some of them are. And my journey has been more twisting and turning, perhaps, than some. real quick reminder, and every workshop I do, I have to mention this. We have intersecting identities, and intersecting identities and intersectionality are different. They're related, but they're different. If you want to learn more about intersectionality, there's great work by Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a law professor. I think maybe still is on the West Coast, but she's one of the early folks who coined the term intersectionality. Intersectionality is about overlaying or intersecting systems of oppression, right? Where because of your identities, if you have more than one identity that's sort of swimming upstream in some system of oppression, if you're experiencing more than one of those, you're experiencing what's called intersectionality. So that's intersectionality. But intersecting identities is something all of us have, right? Some things that make me is I'm white and I'm college educated, and I'm the kid of an immigrant, and I'm a man, and these things layer on top of each other, right? Particularly my whiteness and my manness, these two things overlay each other and reinforce each other because each has its own kind of privilege, and then they sort of compound from there. And so intersecting identities, as we discuss anything about leadership, anything about personality type, anything about communication, we can't do that in a vacuum. Race is in the room with us. Gender is in the room with us. And we need to talk about these things in very plain terms. When I do workshops, I often explain that I was raised by people in the South, in North Carolina, in the 70s and 80s. And when they would mention a new family that moved into the neighborhood who was a Black family, they would whisper the word Black. They'd be like, oh, the new family down from the Williamses, I think they're Black. And I'm like, why are you whispering? Right. And the whispering comes from a place. It comes from people scared to say the wrong thing. I get that. I have felt that. We all probably feel it. And if we can build cultures where we understand that we are all going to mess up, and that as we mess up, we will learn and get better. And as long as we're committed to the learning and getting better, the messing up is reasonable within limits, right? And so because we have to all learn, there's so many cultures that I'm not a part of. I'm not part of blind culture. I'm not part of deaf culture. I'm not part of Latin culture. I'm not part of Black culture. There's so many cultures I'm not a part of that I need to be curious about, and also be humble in my identities that across on each of those dynamics as well. So if we're going to have any kind of meaningful conversation about leadership, we are leading across difference. Those of you who've seen me are probably tired of this, but I like to share that in the negative space between the E and the X and the FedEx logo is an arrow. Not everyone has seen it. When I'm doing live presentations, and last week I was with a group of about 25 on one day. I was with a group of 120 on another day, and I was with a group of about 160 on another day. And in all cases, about 25% of the audience did not know that between the E and the X, there's an arrow. So that's my hope for any of these workshops, is you get one little aha moment that you can never un-aha. I hope that comes across. We've already talked about that. Preference, if you've attended any of the first 4 of these workshops, you understand that preference is not skills. Preference is not all we can do, right? People who talk about extroversion and introversion, sometimes there's a myth that introverts can't do public speaking or extroverts can't develop good listening skills. And those are myths. Skills are separate from our preferences. Preferences are just sort of our subconscious go-to when all other things are equal. In real life, it's rare that all other things are equal, but when all other things are equal, as an extrovert, as someone with an extrovert preference, I prefer to energize from interactions with others. When all other things are equal, people with introvert preferences want to energize themselves from within or with a small social circle. And again, I'm saying when all other things are equal because there's a second letter of the Myers-Briggs, sensing and intuitive. There's this third letter that we're going to talk about today, thinking and feeling. There's the fourth letter, judging and perceiving. And even after we're finished with that, we only have 4 sort of psychological preferences. There's a lot more things that make me that are in the all other things are equal category. So understanding that preference is just sort of that fundamental subconscious thing, and that it's not the entirety of who we are. It's not the entirety of our behavior, and it's not really related to our skills. Those are fundamental to understanding what preference is. My examples I often give is that I love coffee, and that people who don't love coffee, I don't understand. It's hard for me to understand that. That's a preference. I do not like cauliflower, but yet if I was stranded on a desert island and the only food source available was a cauliflower tree or vine or however cauliflower comes out of the ground, I would get very used to cooking cauliflower. And when the Coast Guard came to rescue me, I would first thank them and then say, hey, do you want to try one of my 24 recipes for cauliflower? Even though I have a preference for not eating cauliflower, but I do have a preference for coffee. Also, and this is very critical for today's conversation, that last point there on the screen, talking about dichotomies, but using both hands. One example of a dichotomy is right-handedness and left-handedness. And for my academic friends listening, just like I think Jung's framework for establishing that there's extroversion and introversion, that he didn't have the right kinds of methodological safeguards to really be able to generalize this. I've never seen an empirical study that proves that right-handedness or left-handedness exists either, right? We all sort of have a understanding that that's a phenomenon because we live it. And so that's again, that's one of when people criticize and say, yeah, that can't really be proven. I'm like, I don't know that right-handedness can be proven because I can use my left hand. I'm able to. I'm like, sometimes I get silly and I get my coffee cup. This is my right hand. This is my left hand. I can totally use my left hand for all manner of things. But for this dichotomy in particular, for the third dichotomy, the two hands metaphor is extra important because the way we energize that first letter, extroversion and introversion, is a pretty fundamental preference for a lot of people. And it's pretty well understood, at least intuitively, among folks with extrovert preferences and among folks with introvert preferences. There's certain sets of language and understanding. The second dichotomy, which if you were in our last two sessions and you're exploring how you absorb the world subconsciously, right? You may be using one or more senses. You know, some people have 5 senses, some people have 3, 4, 1. People have lots of different combinations of senses. But beyond your physical senses, the second letter is about your psychological method of absorbing, right? And that half of our audiences, half of the people to whom we speak, have a sensing preference and prefer knowledge in bullet points in a granular nature, one data point at a time. And people with an intuitive preference prefer story-driven and context-driven information, where as they receive the information, as they absorb the information, they're immediately lining it up with what they call schema in education theory. They're immediately lining it up with other parts of their experience to help it make sense for them. And so people with an intuitive preference sometimes might miss details because they have a strong preference for absorbing the pattern of the information and the ways it connects. Meanwhile, people with sensing preferences sometimes might miss the big picture because their preference is for the granular pieces of information on a painting, in music, on a report, on an email. And so understanding that those processes of how you absorb the world are internal processes. We're not usually negotiating that with other people. And then this third letter, we are negotiating with other people. This third letter isn't about how we build our energy, extrovert, introvert. It's not about how we absorb the world, intuition, sensing. It's how we make decisions. And unlike those first two, this is one of those ones that we negotiate out loud with other people every day. Every day. I'm negotiating a decision right now because I have a little bit of a cold. My wife and I are going to have some people over for dinner and we're going to reschedule. And I said, check with them. We can still have them over for dinner, but I'm not going to cook tonight because I'm just not feeling up to it. We could order pizza. So your options, so we're negotiating and we're talking about how we are going about the business of making decisions, right? This third letter of the Myers-Briggs, feeling and thinking, it is our preference for making decisions. And in this instance, in particular, we drive with both hands more than any other dynamic of the Myers-Briggs, simply because if you make decisions based on feeling first, you're surrounded by people who make decisions based on thinking first, and you have to negotiate that. You have to talk about it. If you're someone with a preference for thinking, you're navigating the experience of being around people who are feeling, who are guided primarily by feeling. And so because this one is one of the ones that we unpack out loud with other people the most, that two-handed dichotomy is important, and discerning what your preference is trickier because you may have a feeling preference, but maybe your work environment and your partner or significant other all have thinking preferences. And you've learned to adapt to making decisions based on logic and principle first, just to survive your environments and to keep the peace, or vice versa, right? The vice versa is a little less common, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But understand that this is about how we make decisions. So here's a story, and I'll read this case study. I don't know how many folks are with us today across the different platforms, but the chat is open if you want to share some thoughts. This is the story of Johnny V. Jean. Johnny's a 19-year-old in the area who recently got in some trouble. His cousin, who was a single mom, is a single mom, and she's been struggling to make ends meet. Johnny recently stole a truck full of groceries for his cousin at a small town near your city. 2 weeks later, Johnny was arrested. While he was out on bail, he left your county, which violated the terms of his bail. Violating the terms of his bail increased the local police department's interest in Johnny. A rookie cop named Jay Vierre is assigned to the case to find Johnny and bring him to his court date. You know all of this because Johnny's cousin is the daughter of one of your friends. In other words, one of your friends in the neighborhood, you've watched her daughter grow up, and you've seen Johnny playing out in the front yard with your friend's daughter, and you've seen Johnny has stopped by and gotten lemonade from you, and Johnny's been a kid you've seen in the neighborhood. You don't really know him, but you do have a connection. Now it's a Sunday afternoon, and you hear the doorbell ring at your house, and it's Johnny. The question is, what do you do? So if in the chat, if you have an idea of what you think you might do, share it in the chat. I'm going to sip a cup of coffee, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about what a lot of people say when I introduce these case studies live. By the way, if you're curious, those of you who are musical theater people may recognize this story. It's loosely based on Les Mis, which is a famous musical that I think is a fantastic musical, based on the novel, I think, by Victor Hugo, of the same name. And the characters, the lead character in Les Mis is Jean Valjean, in this case Johnny V. Jean, and his primary claim to fame, the way we come to know him at the beginning of the musical, is that he steals a loaf of bread to feed a starving family, right? So I've tried to sort of build a parallel here. And then the cop, Jay Vierre, there's a guy named Javert who is very, very just obsessed with finding Jean Valjean and bringing him to justice. And so the escaping of prison is a crime that sort of becomes bigger even than the stealing a loaf of bread, but even the stealing of the loaf of bread is a crime. And so the reason I choose this example is, in the musical Les Mis, I think the people who are telling the story are counting on you to pull for a criminal, right? The first thing we know about Jean Valjean, or in this case, Johnny V. Jean, is that he's a thief. And he stole something which clearly breaks the law, but he stole something to sort of satisfy maybe a bigger moral law, maybe less of a municipal law, a city or county or state law. And maybe he's trying to answer to a higher law that's about not letting people be in need. And I'm bringing this up because how we make decisions, what do you do when Johnny comes to your door, are primarily driven, if we're to believe Jung and Isabella Briggs Myers, either by logic and principles first. That's the thinking preference. Logic and principles first. And then as we decide what's logical and what's principally right, as we unpack that, we will consider the good of other people, most certainly. Or do you start with what's the best for the most amount of people, and then build out from that, and then build principles as you go? I know that this sounds as though they intersect each other a lot, and they do. And this is why this third part of the Myers-Briggs is one of the more challenging parts to discern about ourselves. Because if we are people who are driven primarily by logic and principle, we are most certainly around people driven by feeling and are used to negotiating about the good of other people in our decision-making, and vice versa. Something that's important, though, is that, especially in a polarized world like the world that we're in the US at least, is that when you're making these decisions, knowing what your preference is, knowing what others' preferences are, some of this boils down to the starting point, right? And that people who begin their arguments, so for example, it's less about, in other words, if I had 20 people tell me what they think they should do when Johnny rings the doorbell, you might assume that thinking people would be like, nope, stay outside, I'm going to call the cops. And that feeling people would be like, oh, come on in, let me make you some coffee and some cookie and give you some cookies, and I'm going to take care of you. That's a bad assumption. That's a bad assumption. Thinking and feeling is not about what you would decide. It's about, if somebody asked you to justify that decision, why you think it's the right decision. So in workshops, when I've presented this case study, I've heard people say things like, well, I'm really concerned about my safety and my family's safety. I have children at home, And even though I sort of know who Johnny is, if Johnny's skipping out on bail, I'm a little scared for my children's safety, so I'm not going to let him in. So notice how that's counter to the previous assumption that I mentioned, the previous assumption that thinkers would stick to the letter of the law and that feelers would sort of help him because he's a person who needs help. In this instance, some people are making a feeling argument. I'm worried about the safety of my children in my home, person based, and therefore I'm not going to answer the door. Conversely, you might see the other instance where somebody understands that, well, logically speaking, his crime was a misdemeanor. Logically speaking, I've known him, from the neighborhood, whatever. Maybe in your equation, maybe you're a person who does not have children. Maybe you're a person whose children are grown. Maybe there's not that extra layer that you're concerned about. This could intersect your gender as well, right? If you're at home by yourself and you're a woman, the calculation of human safety, etc., by inviting someone who technically is a criminal into your home, that calculation may be different versus if you're a man, it might be different because we know statistics on which way violence is tilted, right? But ultimately, it's not what you decide, but it's the rationale. It's how you get there. Is the first thing you're thinking about the law in your county, city, and state, the how much worse or better it might go if you let him in for you legally, for him legally? Are you mapping it all that way, thinking? Or are you starting with, you know what? He's helping his cousin out. She's a single mom. I get it. I wouldn't have done what he did, but I get it. And we're all struggling. And if him stealing some groceries is the worst thing he's ever done, come on in, buddy. I'm going to get you some coffee and make you some coffee and get you some cookies so that I can help you, right? I've heard a lot of people also talk about whether they would advise Johnny to turn himself in, whether they would say, Johnny, I'm going to turn you in. Even that difference, one might be more feeling, one might be more thinking, leading with the logic and principle. There's a criminal on my doorstep. Logically, I need to call the police versus feeling, which is there's a criminal on my doorstep. But I feel called to help in some way. So this thinking and feeling dichotomy, again, all of us make decisions using both. One other distinction that's important is that when I say feeling, in our society, feeling gets a bad rap. Feeling gets reduced to emotional, and there is a gendered aspect to this as men who dominated cultures in the workforce all through the Industrial Revolution in the United States set norms on how much emotion is appropriate in the workplace, right? And then when World War II happened and the GI Bill, as imperfect as it was, gave more access to racialized minorities to enter the workplace. And when Rosie the Riveter and all of those women entered a whole bunch of new fields that previously had not had a lot of women representation, suddenly post World War II, our workforce was so much more diverse, right? And because of that, this idea of being too emotional at work, if you look at different lists on what makes emotionally intelligent leaders, you're going to find many of these lists include a component called managing your emotions. The fact that we consider emotionally intelligent leadership to be in part the degree to which you as a leader manage your emotions at work is emblematic and still a symptom of how men led the Industrial Revolution with Industrial Revolution thinking, right? That thinking fit the Industrial Revolution in a lot of ways, but it has not been refreshed enough yet, right? So moving on, hopefully you can make an educated guess as to whether you have a thinking preference or a feeling preference. That's my hope. And again, logic versus person-centered. And again, all of our decisions involve both. This is one of the murkiest ones, one of the hardest ones to discern because we drive with both hands. More with this one, I'm convinced, than with anyone. And I'm just, this is not from any study I've read, but this is from about 25 years of working with teams as they are looking at a Myers-Briggs or another Jung-based typology instrument, and as they're trying to discern what their actual type is. This one, the contexts in which they work and the contexts of their family always loom more large than any of the other three dichotomies. The other three dichotomies seem to be sheltered in a way, but this one, because we make decisions in groups, in pairs, in all of these things, it tends to be the hardest one to discern. So like I said, this is the most blended one. This is why keeping two hands on the wheel, that analogy, I think, holds. Because we're used to negotiating. Here's the other thing that we do is that oftentimes if we're in an environment where we're a feeler, but we're surrounded by a culture that has preferences for thinking, or if we're a thinker, but we're in an environment that has a preference for feeling, that we tend to, after several discussions and or arguments and or times when we are comparing notes on how to make decisions, if we're the minority preference, we tend to sort of start pre-mapping what the majority is going to say and how the majority is going to lead in their decision making, and then sort of pre-acquiescing to this, right? This is a thing that happens. And so because of that, it can tend to be that can short circuit organizations. Organizations need a healthy balance of thinking versus feeling. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you that different industries are more likely to draw people with different preferences, right? Anybody with any preference can work in any industry. Anybody can build skills, but some people, because of preferences, are more drawn to some industries over others. For example, if you have feeling and your second letter was intuitive, the intuitive feelers, the David Keirsey, a researcher, calls these the idealists, the intuitive feelers. Intuitive feelers are much more likely to seek out helping professions. It's social work, it's school counselors, it's teachers, it's coaches, career counselors, it's people with helping professions. Meanwhile, people with T for thinking and people with maybe S for sensing for their second letter might go into more analytical settings, might go into accounting, might go into research, particularly if it's in the hard sciences, right? With quantitative methodologies where those loom large in that field, right? So understand that if you're a deeply feeling person and you work at an accounting firm, you might feel kind of lonely in this regard, right? This is where my coworkers or my boss aren't feeling enough, right? This is where that comes to play. Meanwhile, if you work for a large social work organization and you're more thinking and logic driven, surrounded by a lot of feelers, you might feel like your way of making decisions is your preference, your preferred way of making decisions is not being honored. So just be aware of those differences as you manage across that difference. I'm going to tell you the story of my old vice president, Mr. Salzano. He was a former football player at University of North Carolina and eventually played for the Dallas Cowboys, or as he put it, was a member of the Dallas Cowboys team. I don't know how much playing time he got, but he was a really fantastic leader. And I'm going to tell you why. I'm a feeler in this Myers-Briggs dichotomy. And so I'm going to tell you that when I worked for Mr. Salzano, I was a loan officer. So I was helping people get consumer loans. So automobile loans, mortgages. Oh, Angela, hey, thanks. Can SN and FT influence each other? I'm an SF, but choose helping profession, not analytical. Angela, yes. And your last letter of your first and last letter of your Myers-Briggs help me understand which of your two middle letters is more dominant, right? And so, Angela, the fourth letter of the Myers-Briggs, which we're going to talk about in April, the fourth letter of the Myers-Briggs, and knowing whether someone has an introvert or extrovert preference. And Angela, if I remember, I think you might have an extrovert preference, but Angela, if you're comfortable sharing all four letters, I can answer your question a little bit better. Because in the Myers-Briggs, either if S and F are your two middle letters, either the S or the F, one of those is going to be your dominant in Jungian terms. One of those is going to be your sort of North Star, the thing that guides the ship. And if you can, ESFJ. Okay, so ESFJ, so J is judging. Okay, so Angela, in this case, ESFJ, J tells me that your dominant is feeling, not sensing. That feeling is the thing that makes you the most you, and that sensing is like the second fiddle. That sensing is the second part. And we'll go into this more later on when we go into the J and the P dichotomy, those workshops are in April. But understand, Angela, to your point, can they influence each other? They can, but they're sort of different, because sensing is how you prefer to absorb the world, and feeling is how you make decisions once you've absorbed information. So these are sort of two different antennas, kind of like you have an FM antenna and an XM radio antenna, or an FM and an AM, or whatever. That your sensing is just about how you absorb the world, and your feeling is just about how you make decisions. But there's more to it than that, and that J helps me discern that, and I hope that's helpful. But back to my story about Mr. Salzano. I was a loan officer, and I was constantly going to him, and I'm a feeler. I'm my Myers-Briggs type. Feeling is not my dominant, but it's part of my type. I'm an ENFP. And I was regularly going to Mr. Salzano saying, hey, man, hey, I've got this single mom. She's struggling to make ends meet. She needs a loan to fix her car for $5,000 because she has a job interview in 2 weeks, and she needs her car fixed so she can get to the job interview so she can get back on her feet. Right? This is a very feeling argument. I'm giving you a very feeling argument. My vice president, Mr. Salzano, would say, Alan, listen, this is a bank, right? This is a bank. I need to know her debt to income ratio. I need to know her credit score. I need to know her disposable income totals so that we can make a logic-based decision, right? He's giving me thinking back. I'm coming at him with a feeling argument. He's giving me a thinking argument. But here's why Mr. Salzano was a good leader. He recognized that I was a feeler. He recognized that my preference was feeling. So he met me there. He would first tell me the logical part. He'd say, you need to look at her debt to income ratio, her disposable income, and her credit score. Then he would say to me, Alan, remember, this is the State Employees Credit Union. So it's a credit union. It's a nonprofit bank. He would say, if we give her a loan and she can't pay it back, that's going to affect all the rest of our members at the credit union. That includes school teachers and Department of Transportation workers. So notice what he did, and this is good leadership. This is bridging the thinking and feeling gap. He gave me the reason he couldn't say yes in his terms, in thinking, principled, logical terms. And then he also gave it to me in my terms. He gave it to me also in feeling terms. That's good leadership. When you understand that you have a preference for feeling, you need to show folks that you are leading and managing that you also understand logic and principle-based concerns. You need to show them that. If you're more logical and principle-based, you need to show those that you're leading that you can lean into the good of people with some regularity, kind of like Mr. Salzano did. So as you provide rationales for decision, do it in your language, whether that's thinking or feeling, but then also explain it in their other way. When you think about making your decisions, if Mr. Salzano could have been challenged, he knows that I keep coming to him with these feeling-based arguments. Maybe he looks at how much latitude he does have. Maybe he does shift some of his decision-making and go, well, our headquarters tells us that we have this much wiggle room, and I don't usually use this much wiggle room, but I'm hearing this feeling argument about this member of our community who's in need, and maybe I can use this wiggle room a little bit to be a little more person-centered, even though it's a risk. So beyond kind of coaching, managing, and leading others across this difference, it can also help you with your own decision-making. If you know you have a feeling preference, when you make decisions, pause at some point and go, logic check, logic, principle check. The principles and logic, am I honoring logic and principles here? And vice versa. The vice versa is a little harder because this third bullet point, Isabella Briggs Myers indicated in one of her books that the type A business personality, which is sort of the dominant culture in the US, is typified by the ESTJ personality type. And I mentioned this in one of the other webinars, but ESTJ, extrovert, is gift of gab, talking to others, energizing from the external world. Sensing is give me the details and the facts, but I just want facts. I don't need context. I don't need background. That's the word of the intuitives. I just want the facts, right? Joe Friday, just the facts. Sensing. Thinking is once I have the facts and I need to make decisions, I'm just going to be data driven and use logic, period, full stop. And the J just adds organizational fuel to the fire. In other words, if as a T, you're like, I'm going to organize our decision making logically, when it comes time to implement, the J is like, I'm going to implement in a very closure oriented and data oriented way. And we'll talk more about that J in upcoming presentations. But that ESTJ, Isabella Briggs Myers, is like, that's the type A business personality. That's the kind of thinking that typifies most of our business environments. Notice that doesn't honor feeling, right? If we're talking about this thinking and feeling thing. Also, let's talk about intersecting identities for just a second. These statistics are a little outdated, about 13, 14 years old. But when I got my Myers-Briggs training, I learned that roughly 65% of women in the US score feeling on the Myers-Briggs, and roughly 65% of men scored thinking on the Myers-Briggs in the US. When I was given these statistics, I was also shared that in Africa, it was about 50-50. In Europe, it was about 50-50. In South America, there was a little bit of this gender difference. But we often talk about nature and nurture, and I do not know the answers. But having grown up in the United States, I can tell you I'm very aware of the way that society seeks to socialize men and socialize women. and that socializing men around logic and principles and not being person-centered or emotion-centered makes sense to me based on my lived experience, and society pressuring women or socializing women to be nurturing or feeling or person-centered is something that I've also observed a lot of. And so even though I do not have any studies to back this up, it's something that resonates deeply with me in terms of my lived experience and my experience working with leaders within organizations, right? So understand that in a lot of business culture, thinking and principles and logic are honored first because that's sort of how businesses in the Industrial Revolution worked, right? And because businesses have stockholders and stockholders want a return on investment, and it's sort of part of this capitalistic system, right? I'm not saying that is good or bad on its face. I mean, I have a separate commentary for that for another webinar. But what I'm saying is that for better or worse, most of the decision making that large organizations are doing run on the STJ engine, and so decision making that prioritizes feeling is less honored in a lot of our spaces. And so yeah, so this is all. I've told y'all that this would be a little bit shorter today because I'm a little under the weather, and so I appreciate some grace. I do know that we have 3 great workshops coming up. If you have any questions in the chat, put some questions in the chat. I'll hang out for a few minutes. But the last 3 in this series are going to be all in April 9th, 16th, and 23rd. On April 9th, we're going to go to the other side of this coin, right? Today was about, what if I think that my supervisors aren't very feeling, they're not very caring. What about the opposite? What about supervisors that aren't very logical, right? So next time, which is in 2 weeks, April 9th, we're going to talk about that, right? Maybe you're a thinking person, thinking preference person, and your supervisor's a feeling preference person, and you feel like that they don't lean on logic enough. That's what that's going to be about. And then those last 2, figuring out why supervisors are uptight and our supervisors are really bad at follow through. First of all, I want to acknowledge that I think the word uptight can be charged sometime across gender and race, so I want to acknowledge that. I had a hard time finding a good synonym, but I want to just acknowledge that. But this last dichotomy of the Myers-Briggs, the judging and the perceiving, is sort of 2 different things. One of them is our social and organizational style. Odds are good that people with a J preference have nice, tidy desks. Odds are good that people with perceiving preferences have less organized desks. But that's only one way of understanding that last dichotomy. There's a whole separate way, and Angela, this goes back to your question earlier about can the letters influence each other, because the other way to understand judging and perceiving is it helps people like me make sense of all 4 of your letters to understand what's the most important part of your psychological makeup. And it introduces us to something called our blind spot. And again, that language is a little bit ableist, but it's meant to evoke things that we have a hard time perceiving about ourselves when we're under stress. So those last 2 on April 16th and 23rd, we're going to go a little bit into social organizational style, but we're also going to tell you how to use your understanding of type to manage stress better. So thank you for some grace today, because I know we're ending a little bit early today, but I need to do some self-care. And thank you for your time. Go ahead and register on LinkedIn for our upcoming ones and invite some friends along. But hope you have an amazing